Okay, I'd like to say a couple of things about the nature of social problems. This one should be a relatively short video, I hope. So when we talk about social problems, what we're talking about are socially induced conditions that harm any segment of the population, as well as patterns of behavior that people believe warrant public concern and collective action to address. I'll get into a little bit of what that means and break it down a bit. Let's start by pointing out that social problems may have one or both of two different aspects. So there are two different aspects potentially to social problems. And social problems, as we understand them, will have always at least one of these and sometimes both of these aspects. The first is what we call an objective reality. What this means is that the social problem can be measured empirically, right? There are data to support the assertion that something is problematic, that something is creating harm for a segment of the population, etc. The second element is what we call the subjective element. This is the idea that social problems can, in the end, be anything that we collectively identify as such. So what this reflects, this second aspect, is that social problems are socially constructed. And what that means, of course, is that we collectively as a society agree that something is a problem. And it can be an actual problem, in which case there would be an objective element to it as well. Or it could just be that there is a perception that something is a social problem. So you can have a social problem that has an objective reality, but that is not considered a social problem. A great example of this might be suburbs and a predominant suburban form of residential pattern and commercial patterns in terms of where people live in the United States. Most people don't think of the suburbs as a social problem, but you can point to concrete measurable harm that is created by, as a consequence of this particular pattern of city development. The amount of energy expended to push resources and commerce and housing farther and farther away from an urban core means that you are spending you're spending more money. You're consuming more land. That's a problem for both a diminishment of arable land, right? Land that's close to the city that can be farmed, but also you're creating significant amounts of paved area. That affects, of course, the degree to which water can be absorbed into the soil in, say, for example, heavy rains or after a long winter with a lot of snow, which can lead to flooding. The time that people spend commuting from cities to suburbs and back results in tremendous amounts of lost productivity and time wasted in traffic, to say nothing of the environmental impact of pollution and all of that, right? So there are concrete measurable harms that are created by suburbs. But again, most people, not everybody, but most people would probably not think of suburbs as a social problem. So there's one of those situations where you've got something that's objectively harming society or creating objective harm, but that isn't being understood or constructed as a social problem. On the other side of the equation would be a situation in which something is treated as a social problem that isn't actually a social problem. An example that you've read about in the supplemental readings is the piece by Best and Horiuchi on Halloween sadism, or some of the things that you might have read in Glassner's Culture of Fear, right? So we treat Halloween sadism, right? The idea that some random stranger is trying to poison or harm our children through adulterated Halloween treats. We treat that as an actual problem, but it isn't. Nobody has died of poisoned Halloween candy or razor blades and apples or any of that stuff. So people still treat that as a social problem, even though it isn't. So that would be one of those situations in which we have a subjective element, the perception of a social problem, even though there isn't a social problem, an empirical social problem at its core. And then, of course, there are some social problems that have both an objective reality and a subjective element. So crime or pollution or homelessness or those kinds of things. So you've got three different possibilities, right? You've got a situation where a social problem can be sort of objectively real and people understand it to be a social problem. You can have a social problem that is objectively real, but people don't treat as a social problem. And then you can have a social problem that isn't real, but nevertheless commands our attention and is treated as a problem. Right? And so we're going to look at understanding all three of the variations. And also, of course, some conditions that are related to that, some consequences and some outcomes. So, for example, we're going to ask ourselves, how do harmful conditions arise out of structural and cultural arrangements? So when we look at objectively measurable social problems, we're going to ask ourselves, how do the current structural and cultural arrangements in American society lead to those particular outcomes? We're going to also ask ourselves why some objectively harmful conditions aren't seen as social problems. Why aren't we treating the suburbs as a social problem, for example? And then, of course, the third thing we're going to look at is why do some things that are non-problematic conditions or non-existent conditions still end up getting treated as social problems? So three different kind of themes or variations that we would want to explore in relationship to the nature of these social problems. So the objective reality of a social problem just points to conditions in society that induce material harm or psychic suffering for certain segments of the population. And again, that understanding kind of focuses on the objective reality of these social problems, grounded in material conditions, measurable through observation. This is really the easy part. Getting people to see it that way is a different trick, right? But we can point to empirical conditions and say, here is the objective measurable harm that's being done. So when we look at that, that's gonna lend itself to particular kinds of sociological and historical and geographic methodologies that allow us to sort of present a case. When we focus on the subjective nature of social problems, the idea of what is and what is not a social problem, we're going to be looking at definitions, right? How are these things constructed? What does that process look like? And to sort of underscore this and to sort of talk a little bit about the nature of social constructs, it's really important that we have a grasp of what sociologists have come to call the Thomas theorem, or definition of the situation. And this is a concept that focuses on the importance of the role of consensus. So W.I. Thomas was a sociologist at the University of Chicago back in the early 1900s, who sort of very famously studied how people coming to the United States, specifically to Chicago, from other parts of the world, navigated their new environments using cultural resources that they had acquired back in their countries of origin. And in 1927, he does a study. He's concluding a study of Polish immigrants. And in the write-up of this, there's this very famous quote where he writes, "If men perceive situations as real, they are real in their consequences." You can update the language, of course, for the 21st century and say, if people define situations as real, they are real in their consequences. And what this means is that people act in the world based on perception. So if people think a thing is a social problem, they will act toward that thing as if it is a social problem. If people don't believe that something is a social problem, they will not act toward it as a social problem. Now, just as a sort of popular cultural aside, people, outside of the social sciences, will sometimes take this and run with it in some very strange directions. Like I had a former dean once who used to say sort of regularly, perception is reality. And I want to be very, very clear. That is not true. Reality is reality, right? My perception Notwithstanding, if I believe I can fly and I jump off the roof of my building, I'm going to die, or at least be very seriously injured. My perception of an ability to fly does not grant me the ability to fly, right? So perception is not reality. But if my belief in my ability to fly is strong enough, I might still jump off the roof, right? It doesn't mean I'm going to be able to fly, but I am going to behave as if my perception is reality until something comes along to remind me that it isn't. So most people aren't jumping off buildings with the mistaken belief that they can fly, but if people, for example, believe that Halloween sadism is a problem, then municipalities are going to put restrictions, for example, on the practices around Halloween. They might open up the local hospital and ask you to bring your treats in to be X-rayed before you let your children eat them. They might insist that you only accept candy that's in wrapped and sealed packages, right? So we might treat something as a problem because our perception is that it is a problem, without ever asking whether or not the perception is accurate or not. So again, when consensus is created around a particular definition, then we can end up treating something like a social problem, even if there isn't an empirical or objective foundation for that. The risk is the risk of this kind of overemphasis of the subjective nature of social problems then is that we may end up wasting a lot of resources trying to solve a problem that isn't a problem, and not having the resources to and the perceptions necessary to grapple with the things that actually are problems. So the subjective nature of a social problem and its socially constructed nature is something we want to understand, if for no other reason then we can kind of stop focusing on those things and start focusing on the actual problems, the real problems that are facing us. Okay, last thing I want to point out before I wrap this up is the difference between what we call person blame approaches and system blame approaches. So a person blame approach assumes that social problems kind of result from the pathologies of individuals, right? So people make bad decisions or they engage in poor behaviors, and that the problems that we see in society stem from those actions. And so the solutions, of course, that would be necessitated by that perspective would be individual level interventions. A system blame approach, on the other hand, is the assumption that social problems arise from social conditions. That is not surprisingly the approach that sociology tends to take. Right? Without denying that individual behaviors can have consequences for a person's life, the vast majority of social problems originate in social arrangements. I study homelessness, and I've been studying homelessness since the mid-90s. Many people in the United States, perhaps still a majority in the United States, assume that homelessness results from alcohol or drug dependency, mental health issues, when in fact the vast majority of homelessness in the United States is the result of a lack of access to affordable housing, right? The price of housing has been rising significantly for decades, and wages have not kept pace with that, right? So the vast majority of homelessness in the United States is economic in nature, but the assumption in the general public is that it's the result of individuals making bad choices, and so the interventions are always organized around addressing individual deficiencies or individual needs, and then everyone sort of shrugs and wonders why it is we can't seem to solve homelessness, because we're treating it incorrectly. That isn't to say that people don't make bad decisions, but people making bad decisions is much less likely to create a social problem than a set of structural or cultural arrangements are to create to create a social problem. So that'll kind of wrap us up for this this video. Again, if you have questions, let me know. Shoot me an email or post a question in the discussion forums. And otherwise, I will see you next time.